Welcome everybody to what I'm sure is going to be an informed, and I think it's fair to say a much needed discussion about accessibility in the arts. My name's Julian Gwinnett. I'm one of 3 co-chairs here at the University of Wolverhampton's Disabled Staff Network, and I'm joined by one of my fellow co-chairs, Melanie Best. Yes, Melanie's here. Yeah, but before we begin, I think a little bit of background and context to this discussion. During last year's talks, a few of our speakers identified a number of accessibility problems for disabled people. Now, whether that's being able to access gallery spaces, exhibitions, or events because they're not inclusive of their needs, or because as disabled artists, they're often overlooked and ignored by mainstream galleries. Hence why we're here to have this discussion. Also, why disabled artists struggle, just as disabled people in general struggle, to overcome the barriers they face and the impact this has that is not fully acknowledged or realised. That, speaking from my own experience, can have like an impact on your mental well-being, your confidence and your belief in yourself. I think we also need to talk a bit about whether these issues are societal problems, and is the art world just merely reflecting some of the negative attitudes towards disabled people that are prevalent within our society. And finally, I hope we can get a chance to talk about the future and what that future might look like. So that if we were to reconvene at some point in the future, that this would be a very, very different conversation, or even that there would be no need for this conversation to happen at all. This is also an opportunity for people to sort of engage in this conversation themselves. So if you have a question, please feel free to add that question to the chat, and we will endeavour to answer as many of those questions as possible at the end of this session. Now, I'm very fortunate to be joined in this conversation by the panellists for today's discussion. I have with me Jennifer Gilbert and Paul Darke, whose talks from last year, brilliant talks from last year, form the basis of much of this discussion, or the idea behind this discussion, and also joined by Charlotte Dunn as well, and Melanie, who's just popped on screen as well. Now, rather than me introduce everybody myself and do a very, very bad, poor job of doing that, I thought I'd ask everybody to introduce themselves and maybe say a bit about, well, first of all, who you are, a little bit about yourself, and perhaps a bit about where you see yourself within the context of this conversation. And also, rightly, we were having a brilliant conversation beforehand, and it was mentioned that we perhaps should also describe ourselves, and I can't possibly ask other people to do that without attempting to do so myself. So I am, how do I describe myself? As a neurodiverse person, that's a very difficult question to answer, but I will do my best, I promise. So I'm middle-aged, I'm wearing glasses, I'm in serious need of a haircut. My hair is well below my ears at the moment, and I'm wearing a very sky blue, baby blue jumper. I'm bearded, and that's a very good point for me to stop, because I'm running out of adjectives to describe myself right now. So who shall I pick on first? Charlotte, would you like to go first?
Yes, thank you, Julian. Hello, everyone. My name's Charlotte Dunn. I'm an artist from Shropshire. I'm also Marketing Officer for the Faculty of Art, Business and Social Sciences at the University of Wolverhampton. A lot of my artwork looks at invisible illnesses and expressing illnesses visually, so creating work, working with researchers to create a visual aid for hidden illnesses, and how we can begin to talk about illnesses that might be hidden, and creating a visual form of that to help us express our illnesses and help us feel more comfortable about us if we do have an invisible illness, or if we do suffer from any particular illness or mental illness. So yeah, I'll describe myself. So I don't know whether I'm middle-aged yet. I don't know if I've quite got there yet. But I'm around 30. I've got long curly blonde hair up in a ponytail today. I'm white and I'm wearing a white jumper. So yeah, thank you. Nice to see you all.
Who wants to go next? I've got to pick on somebody. Paul, can you go next?
Okay, I'll go next. I'm Paul Darke. I'm a 60-year-old white guy with a white beard, black hair, wear glasses, overweight, wearing a lot of black. I always wear black, makes me look thinner. I run a disability arts organisation in Wolverhampton called Outside Centre. We commonly more known as Digital Disability, because that's our website, www.digital-disability.com. And we have been working in the arts as an organisation for about 24 years. Prior to that, I helped set up the West Midlands Disability Arts Forum. I then ran the West Midlands Disability Arts Forum for a few years in the late 90s. And I was also an advocacy officer for a large national charity for my sins. But we try and keep that one quiet. The charity I work for, that is. So, yeah, I've been working in disability arts for probably about 30 years, really. And it came from doing my PhD in disability and British cinema in 6 films. And I can't tell you what the 6 films are because I can never remember what they are, partly because it was so long ago. But yeah, that's who I am. And I'm looking forward to the questions, the chat and the conversation. Thank you.
And finally, Jennifer.
Hi, my name's Jennifer Gilbert. I'm a white woman in my late 30s with bright red hair and a blunt fringe. Today I'm wearing a black top and I'm sat in front of a black and white drawing and a wooden sculpture. I am a gallerist, producer and curator working with disabled, neurodivergent, deaf, learning disabled and self-taught artists across the UK and internationally. I work alongside galleries and museums to make them more inclusive and accessible. My gallery is called the Jennifer Lauren Gallery, and I guess my position in this is that I host exhibitions of the artists that I've just mentioned. I support them through professional development, and as I mentioned, I work with galleries and museums to kind of make the sector more accessible.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Now, shall we get started? And my first question is, which I think is going to be, well, no, there's no point beating around the bush. Let's just jump in there. So, what do you think about the way mainstream galleries represent disabled and neurodivergent artists at present, and are they doing enough? Democracy is really important, so whoever wants to go first, please raise your hand. Jennifer.
They're not doing enough, but they're aware. A lot of them are aware that they're not doing enough, and they're trying to put provisions in place to make them better equipped to work with deaf, disabled and neurodivergent artists. It's a slow process, but it's happening and it's starting to move forwards, and I'm feeling very positive about it.
And what are those provisions exactly?
I've just been working with the Plus Tate network, which is a network of the 48 of the biggest visual arts organisations around the UK, which includes all of the Tates. It includes things like the Baltic, MK Gallery, First Sight in Colchester. And I'm working with the Plus Tate, the people that run Plus Tate, and an organisation called DANC, which is the Disabled Artist Networking Community. And we've had a series of online sessions with all of these organisations talking about, firstly, why they don't work with this group of artists or what their barriers are to them. And then I invited 4 deaf, disabled and neurodivergent artists to be part of the discussions to find solutions to help them move forward. And we're just finalising a toolkit that's going to be rolled out nationally, wider than the Plus Take network now, to all these visual arts organisations and anyone else that wants it, which it gives great examples and solutions to how people should work with these artists and better support them. So it covers things around how to put on accessible exhibitions, to how you can think about paying artists that are on benefits, thinking about consultancy with these artists, accessible events. I'm trying to think what else is in there. It's a very long, thorough document, so that if someone's doing something in particular, like a call out, they would go to that particular section of the document and look at the different ways that they can make their call outs more accessible to this group of artists, so that more people feel that they're able to apply. And it mentions things like they should have access budgets put into these call outs to support people with different needs to be able to apply, and have things like easy reads and BSL interpretation in place. So all of these different things are listed, and it's basically your guidebook moving forwards to how these organizations are going to better support it. And they all want to do it, and they all have a willing to do it. We just know that it's going to be a slow process.
I mean, it's really interesting what you said there, because I mean, everything you just said, but the thing that's jumped out at me particularly is that I know from experience, and this isn't just the art world, this is generally how we approach disabilities, that we often forget to actually include the disabled people themselves in the conversation. And you mentioned there that was it personally invited or?
Yeah, so from the outset, the whole thing was, I mean, DANC, the whole organisation DANC is led by disabled artists, various different disabled artists. So they're experts by lived experience. But the big thing for me as well is that they're not a visual arts based organisation. They cover all of the creative sector. So I invited 4 visual artists. So there was a neurodivergent artist, a deaf artist, a learning disabled artist, and a physically disabled artist, that all came to these online sessions, so that it was a well-rounded view that was being given to these visual arts organisations, and they could ask and hear directly from people that were giving their personal experiences of these galleries and museums, or of ways they've been treated and things that they liked and things that they didn't like. So for me, it's really important that they were listening to the voices of the people that this document is aimed to support.
Can you recall like any specifically sort of like the things that were in that document where people said specifically things that they didn't like and specifically the things that they did like?
There's too many to mention. You'll have to wait for the toolkit to come out. But
I have to be patient.
It's all very it was all very solutions focused. So it wasn't attacking people. It was because everyone wants the art world to move forward and be more accessible and inclusive. Everyone was very positively taking something that might have been said and being, so the ways that we can move forward from this and the things that you can implement moving forwards, starting from something basic to something more complicated should you get the funding. So it's kind of like it gives that broad depth of, you can implement these things immediately. And if you are able to access some different funds, you can then implement X, Y, and Z to make it even better in the future.
Oh, thank you. Who wants to go next? Do I see any hands?
Yeah, I'll go. I think, I went, I think the Tate thing is an exceptionally good thing, that collective. With Dash in particular, and again, I used to work for Dash many years ago in Shropshire, and I think particularly for people with what's often called learning difficulties in the neurodivergent, I think there's some great strides being made there, and I think the research being done by people such as Jade French is exceptional as well. And her presentation at the Tate last week was really incredible. I think the work she's doing in challenging the whole nature perception of both what art is and how you can engage in it and how you can produce it is something to behold that I think is taking it further forward in the sense that, because I think often, and again, because unlike Charlotte, who I'm twice her age, sadly, I often get the feeling that we keep reinventing the wheel, and there is an element of that in all that we're seeing, you know, across the country, and even to some extent with the TAPE thing. But I think the research within the universities that's backing it up is going to make the real difference, and actually that will impact on policy and equally funding. I think my primary problem is the consequences of failure to engage are often not there. So, for example, I think the Arts Council, who I am highly critical of in the past for their failure to ensure engagement and inclusion across the board without any consequences for that, in the sense that if you didn't do it, it didn't particularly make any difference. If you were just ticking boxes, and that's often what it was in the past, there were no consequences either. Whereas, and I am a great believer actually that disability equality is really easy to achieve. It is absolutely easy. It's not hard. You just have to want to do it. And if you want to do it, you can do it. And if you don't want to do it, there needs to be consequences. So, for example, working with a number of galleries in the past, they didn't want to engage, they didn't want to do anything. I personally think their funding should have been instantly cut because it was against the principles of funders and everything. And hopefully this time, although I'm a bit concerned, I know the Arts Council have recently said that, you know, what to the question, what if people don't do it? What they're supposed to do in relation to access and disability, you know, they'll just tell them to try harder. That's not good enough for me. I think there needs to be consequences and much more pressure put on them. But I do think, particularly with the TAPE stuff and the stuff that Jennifer is doing and the research coming out of, say, Leeds University and others as well, that I think this could be a real moment of transition. It won't be fast. It won't be en masse, it will be slow, but I think it could be quite different to what's gone in the past, so that we aren't merely reinventing the wheel like we have done. And again, as I said, my age, I've seen the wheel reinvented, particularly in relation to disability arts, probably 3 times. And I think that can be quite disheartening, but hopefully this time's going to make a difference.
Can I just add in, for anyone that's not aware of what Jade French is doing? Jade French is funded, it's got a very large part of funding to do this thing called the Irregular Art School, and she's been working with the Pyramid of Arts, which is a studio for learning disabled artists in Leeds, and they're looking at the traditional art school model. And one of their hopes coming out of this is that they'll be able to set up a kind of a degree that's more 80% creative activity and only 20% of something other, which won't necessarily have to involve writing. So they're trying to set up an arts degree that's more suited to people that aren't able to write long dissertations and long documents and explain their work with words and that sort of thing. So that's a very big part of what they're doing. So Jade presented at a conference last week at the Tate called Explorers, and she was sharing a bit of that with some of the artists that were involved.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add to that question?
I suppose I would just say look up Jade French, because I think her work is probably available online through the University of Leeds, something like that, and probably other forums looking for what's coming up with what she's doing, because she's very, very good.
Okay. Now, I'm very aware that we're very, very fortunate to have a variety of different experiences and different sort of like associations within the art world, within our panelists today. So I'm going to ask a question about, I mean, within the context of time, which so you just alluded to beautifully, Paul, when you were speaking just now, is that I think when we look at where we are now in relation to where we've come from, you know, the past, not necessarily the distant past, but the relatively recent past even, are we, in terms of, you know, embracing accessibility, are we moving forwards? Are we sort of standing a little bit still, treading water a bit on this issue? Or are we maybe even in danger of going a little bit backwards, thinking in terms of recent global events and how they may have had an impact? Who's going to be brave enough?
I think we're going forward. I think we are, but I think the problem, you know, it's a bit like when you see a drama on the television, and you often see people go, oh, you know, this is a game changer. You know, and I think a lot of people feel that about the kind of stuff that's happening at the moment. It isn't a game changer, and it will be a very slow transition, because I think, for example, keenness and enthusiasm may exist in various places, but often it is limited to key staff. They move, that ends. So, but I'm optimistic that this can make a real difference within, and I think that's partly because it's good to see. What I was going to say, partly because of the nature, or because of the disintegration of society across the board. I think people are beginning to see, with the current political situation that we have, as well as the geopolitical, you know, the politics of war and all that kind of stuff, people are beginning to see that society does need a radical change. You know, don't get me wrong, still lots that don't see that and actually want to stick within a very traditionalist kind of view. But actually, en masse, I think, particularly within the educated middle classes, who are often the gatekeepers to all of this, there is the beginning to see that actually this can't go on as it was, and that is going to be the catalyst for this gradual, slow change. I think that's what I'd say.
Do you see a particular involvement here for disabled people? Because one of the things that struck me actually about thinking back to your talk last year, you said something that I was almost like literally punching the air with delight overhearing you say, which is that, you know, as something you said something like, as disabled people, we think differently, we see differently, we experience the world differently, and that obviously is not generally acknowledged. And I think that we're almost able to sort of like acknowledge the need for change within our societies, but also able, to some extent, but to be able to understand what that change should actually be. Perhaps that, based on maybe our experiences, what we've encountered during our lives, the experiences we've had, the struggles and the barriers that we've overcome. I mean, is that something that you can relate to in any way?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say I've always believed disabled people's experiences across the board of what our culture is and what it represents, and the diversity and the variability within that existing culture of disability, is the key to unlocking the future of civilization. And that sounds like a really crazy, excessive idea, but actually, until, you know, put it in a simple way, until you liberate us, you're not going to be liberated. Non-disabled people are never going to be liberated until we're free. You know, and it's partly following on from that kind of Nelson Mandela thing about, you know, as long as one person's in chains, we're all in chains. And I would say that as long as one person has no conception of what disabled people have to offer as a way of unraveling the nature of life and the way we live, we're all going to be trapped. And I think that follows on from what I said last year, which I think is what you're getting at. And I think that some of the work, I think it comes back to Jade French, and particularly the work she's doing, and theoretically bringing that into practice with the Tate gang and Jennifer, etc., can be that moment. But again, it's going to be a slow thing. Nothing happens quickly.
Yeah, it's almost as if the world we see is like a very sort of like narrow horizon that we can't really see beyond, to see sort of anything beyond that in terms of any form of advancement or any form of like radical change that might be, you know, create a world that's vastly different to the world we live in. And yet all through history, that change has been really quite dramatic. Because I'm quite sure that if you could somehow steal a time machine of some description and go back a couple of centuries and speak to somebody alive in the late 18th century, they would very passionately tell you that the feudal system was going to be around forever. And they probably wouldn't have any conception whatsoever that that world in which they lived in, all those experiences were going to change very, very, very dramatically. And yet we continue to think much like they do.
Absolutely. I think that's a very good example in the sense that, because actually it hasn't changed that dramatically. It's been a very slow, gradual change. Feudalism still exists in large parts of the world in various forms, in some sectors of society, and what we see now is often a more civilized version of feudalism. If you can have a more civilized version of feudalism, which is quite a contradiction in itself. But equally, I think one of the things that we offer and we also force upon people is the fear of change, because I've always been a great believer that if you start to understand disability purely, your whole worldview unravels. The whole nature of society unravels once you start to understand disability oppression. And that in itself is a frightening thought, is what's going to replace it, what's going to be there differently. And I think that's both our gift to the world, that is at the same as liberating as it is creating fear in society. I think, for example, the threat that we represent in contemporary society, for example, is indicated by the way many right-wing neoliberal societies are doing their utmost to destroy what we represent because of the fear that we represent. But I think, yeah, we'll get there one day.
But hasn't that, in a sense, always been the case? Because just earlier today, one of our speakers showed a picture of disabled people wearing black triangles, where the black triangle symbol comes from, in actually concentration camps during the Second World War, and then going back even further to that, to sort of like Spartan society and the practice of of infanticide against people that they determined to be of no significance and no value to their society. So are we merely just carrying on the sort of same mindset but using different means to achieve the same objectives?
On a bleak day, yes. I always argued that the lesson from the Nazis for society was that societies learned to do it, make people want it rather than force it upon them, which is a terribly bleak view. But equally, I think we have more allies, more opportunities through art, often primarily through art, to actually challenge that and open a broader range of people to that liberating theology that disabled people represent, that difference represents, and that's the joy. So, to some extent, we are in a worse position than ever, and we are in a better position than ever. And with both those things at the same time, weaving in and out like a snakes and ladders. But I think due to the work of Jennifer and Charlotte, and equally the Tate, what they're doing, as well as I'd like to think what we're doing in digital disability, that I think that we're going up more than we're coming down. And I'm fairly loath to say I'm a little bit more optimistic than I would normally project.
So when you say we're kind of like in a sort of like a paradox for us in a way, with the best of the worlds and the worst of worlds simultaneously at the same time. And I mean, I take from what you're saying that part of that is that where we can reach out and we can gain allies, we can sort of like bring into the conversation people who understand us, want to understand us, and also want to help us, and also see the value in us as human beings, and also the value in what we represent, the sort of the ideas that we have that aren't sort of like recognized or valued, that is really happens as a consequence of us having a platform to be able to tell our stories. And of course, art offers that opportunity, it offers that platform, it offers that vehicle for us as disabled people to share our experience and tell our stories, so long as we have the opportunity to do that. And when we don't have that, then the opposite is true.
Yeah. And I think to bring it back to art and access to art, I think it's that spreading almost the propaganda of what we offer is a level now that it never was in the past. Even at the peak of funding, and disability fund is disability art is funded to a lot less degree than it probably ever has been, despite what funders may argue. But I think the spread of it is greater, both nationally, across the diversity of what disabled people are as well. And that's what's really exciting. I think often art is reduced to, you know, and it was in the past, and it's me, you know, it's a nice white middle class people, men in particular. But actually what is happening is that spread of who it's attracting, engaging with, utilizing, curating, exhibiting is much wider than it has. I have problems with elements of it. You know, I don't like the term outsider art. I think that's deeply problematic. I think it's tied into other things. I'm a great believer in the notion of disability art, but they're kind of edge things that, you know, I don't think we should get into. But I think that whole thing that, for example, that the Tate project that Jennifer's involved in is a real, is a gold mine that could open so many avenues for change.
You've hit upon the language and terminology, so that's definitely a conversation I think we need to sort of like have, maybe not now, but later on in this discussion. Can I bring you into this conversation, Jennifer? Have anything that you particularly want to say in relation to this idea of, well, not this idea, this question of, I forget where I was then. Yes.
On mute, sorry. I don't think I want to bring anything in relation to that question. I think Paul's talked quite a lot about it. And also I'm not someone with lived experience of disability, so I don't feel it appropriate that I answer that question.
Okay.
But Paul did say that there's like less funding within disability arts now, and I wholeheartedly disagree with that. I think there's more funding than there ever has been within the disability arts, and lots more organizations that are specifically for or led by disabled creatives were selected as MPOs this year than has ever been selected before, and some people have gone straight in at quite high amounts of money over the next 3 years. So I think there's more funding than ever being pumped into the disability arts field, and supported studios and all of that sort of thing.
So you've noticed that there's a difference here. There's a sort of like, is that something that's relatively recent? Is that something that you can think of that might actually be behind?
Well, yeah, the MPOs were just announced maybe like 2-3 weeks ago or something, and there's so many more. Like DANC, the organisation I mentioned earlier, is now MPO, so they're a disabled networking community. There's Proud and Loud Arts in Manchester. They're a group that works with learning disabled performers. Unlimited is a funding body specifically for disabled artists, which includes like theatre, dance, arts. They went straight in, NPO. Disability Arts Online had an uplift. Lots of the supported studios had uplifts in the amount they were given. So the Arts Council, it really seems to be focusing the money into this area and taking it from other people in order to support these organisations, to support the wider disabled community.
So do you say this is sort of a general acknowledgement that maybe perhaps there has been in the past a degree of underfunding, and now through the efforts of individuals, you know, to a large extent as well, the work that you're doing in sort of championing this cause is actually filtering through to an understanding of the need to sort of maybe address some of the gaps that have previously existed?
I think people are definitely understanding it more, but I think there's been lots more things recently where disabled artists are being recognised, like Project Artworks were up for the Turner Prize last year, and they're a supported studio working with neurodivergent artists based in Hastings, and they were up for the Jarman Award, which is a big film-based award. And there's lots of disabled artists being selected for residencies. There's so much more awareness of these artists and a willingness now to want to support them to do their work. So I think there's definitely a step change happening, and there's definitely more recognition happening. And I think the Arts Council has recognised that and put their funding into this because they're seeing the importance of this work and the good that it's doing, not only for the artists involved, but for audiences being able to see this work and to help reduce the stigma that still very much surrounds these artists. I think it's greatly being reduced by more artists being shown and funded and that sort of thing.
Thank you. Charlotte, you got your hand up.
I was literally just going to repeat exactly what Jennifer just said. I can only really comment on this from an artist point of view, but definitely since COVID, fizzled out a bit, I've seen so many more opportunities for disabled artists, residencies for disabled artists, neurodiversity, specific residencies available for people, and I've seen that definitely over the past year or so, and that there's been more emergence of that, and for people like me with hidden illnesses to apply and sort of speak about your experiences. I myself, I've worked with not just galleries, I've been working with university researchers who want to show medical research that they've been doing into disabilities through an art pathway, and I myself apply for that because I'm interested in science and communicating invisible illnesses and illnesses in that way, but they have become open to art in a way that they want to use art to communicate their ideas and communicate communicate the work that they're doing in researching certain disabilities. So I think, there's just been a lot more that I've seen, a lot more residencies, a lot more opportunities available over the past year or so, definitely, for disabled artists like me to apply for. So yeah, which is always a good thing.
Perhaps somebody can have a response to this, but I mean, has the application process itself changed? I mean, has that changed to be more understanding of reflective of particularly neurodiversity, for instance? I mean, I can remember the old days of Arts Council funding was like pages and pages of forms and documentations for me and a lot of neurodiverse people was just absolutely horrendous. And almost has there been a move towards sort of like making the funding application process itself accessible?
Not with the Arts Council. The Arts Council is still a very lengthy application, but there is an access support budget that allows you to, the Arts Council will pay someone to support you with the application, so that like I quite often do it with disabled artists. I might sit on Zoom with them or sit with them in person, go through some of the questions, and then I put their answers into the questions in the way that the Arts Council would want to read it, because lots of these artists wouldn't be aware of how to answer the questions in the way that the Arts Council wants you to meet those needs. So they do have a budget available. And I guess some opportunities are more accessible and some are still quite lengthy. But again, that's something that this toolkit covers, and something we talked about quite a lot with visual arts organisations, because they're unaware, I think, of the level of detail they're asking and the way they're posing things and how that might have come across to people. And so it's one of the things we've definitely been focusing on. But I think it's going to be a slow change to get to that point. Some people are now kind of doing an expression of interest and then whittling it down so that people aren't having to fill out massive application forms if they don't get through the first bit. So I think that's saving people a lot of time, but I think it's going to take a long time for all applications to be made a lot simplified. But people are willing. There's a willingness. It's just slow.
I think it's not just, in many respects, it's not just the application process itself, because I mean, obviously you can never be successful the first time you actually go through this process. But I think as well as help and assistance with the application process itself, I think, does anybody feel that there perhaps needs to be a little bit more emphasis on like literally the feedback that sort of like people get after they've actually, so they can literally get a sense of, maybe how well they've done in that process, and also maybe how to like guide some points and actually where to sort of like proceed in future applications. If I made that sound, that
I think that just the way again, repeating what Jenny says, it's where you apply is the, depending on where you apply, is the process can be, the Arts Council applications have always been impossible, in my opinion. I always found it very stressful, and I've give up in a way with that one. But sometimes it's a lot easier. But then the feedback thing, I don't think whether you have a disability or not, I think just arts in general, we don't get much feedback on resident. We never, hardly ever, unless you specific. I think I've had one feedback out of all of the residents I've ever sent in, and I think in general that's something that places don't really acknowledge, that artists spend a long time writing application and thinking up ideas, and you hardly ever get feedback whether you're disabled or not. It's obviously if you ask for it you could, but yeah, I think that's just something in general that a lot of places lack in doing, is acknowledging people's work and acknowledging people's ideas, and that the time this can take, and you don't get feedback regardless of whether you're disabled or have any disability at all. It's just something that's general lacking a lot in residencies, in my experience anyway. I think I've had one feedback my whole time of being an artist, which might just be my experience, but yeah, it would help. It would make people feel more confident. It would give you more drive to future apply, and perhaps something that is lacking in your applications in the past. But yeah, it's just something that just doesn't generally happen in what I've seen anyway.
I think it's slightly coming at it because I used to work for organizations as well. It's not that they don't acknowledge the length of time that it's taken people. I think they fully acknowledge that things will have taken people varying amounts of time. It's often due to the capacity of the staff team. The thing that crops up quite a lot from the work that I've been doing recently is that some people don't state from the outset whether you're going to get feedback or not. And I think if people were clear from the outset when you applied, like, we can give feedback, or unfortunately that we can't give feedback, then the artist will know from the outset whether that's going to take place or not. It's the fact that people aren't stating it, and then it's up to the artist to be like, do I want to then ask for it, not knowing whether it's going to be available or not. But on the whole, I would say for organizations' point of view, it all comes down to the capacity of the organization and how many people are put onto that task, and usually it's one person, and they just simply don't have the capacity to give feedback to every individual.
Which I would say is a massive failure on the part of the Arts Council. I think that is a massive failure. I think I do have big problems with the Arts Council. I think, for example, and I would say that the level of funding now is getting back to what it was in the 90s. There were a vast number of disability organisations. There are a vast number of disabled artists getting funding. Many more actually artists getting funding than organisations. And then it sort of ended at the end of the 90s, and they're now getting back to it after the Cultural Olympiad, the Paralympics of 2012. It's the problem of being old, as you remember, which is a terrible thing, because it would be nice not to remember. But I think the fact that the Arts Council has this agenda, and it's not just the Arts Council, I'm being very unfair on the Arts Council, because one of the other problems that has massively affected disabled people in relation to arts, local authorities used to provide an extensive and extortionate amount of money to complement the Arts Council, and that has almost all disappeared through, not just 10 years of austerity. It was going before then, from 2000 onwards, when kind of structures changed, and I think there are serious issues across the board. But as I've said before, I think there is reason to be hopeful, and I think that's what hopefully we're focusing on today, to get to that, because I think it is a new beginning. You can pick holes in it. I think there's much too much money goes to organisations and not enough to individual artists. I think there's far too much of organisations funding disability art. The galleries themselves should be funding, but that's splitting hairs, and that's the nature of society as it is. But I think it's particularly from what Charlotte has said, and from all the other artists I ever meet, the lack of feedback. If you are trying to create an agenda for that inclusion, is a major failure on the part of the Arts Council, combined with the difficulty of the application process. Actually even just getting onto the Arts Council list to be able to apply can take you multiple attempts, and that's just unforgivable.
Mel, I see you.
Hi, so I'm afraid you'll have to slightly forgive my ignorance here because I work in the School of Sport at the university, so I'm slightly out of my comfort zone with this. But I'm interested to know a little bit about how credible you feel disabled artists feel they're kind of treated within galleries in terms of where their artwork is positioned, in reflecting on kind of Jennifer's comments last year about sometimes disabled artwork being placed next to the toilets kind of thing. Is there work still to be done, or is this something that is changing?
I've personally never, I mean, I'm how to put this, I've never personally had, in terms of putting my work up, well, actually change this. I have had not received help or funding in terms of installing my work in places. So if I've done a residency and I'm epileptic, so you know, I also have severe ulcerative colitis, so I get very tired. I can't lift heavy objects particularly, and there also is a danger of being epileptic in certain environments, you know, having a fit in certain environments. So there are some residencies I've done have been, it depends on the establishment. I think I've had help in installing artwork. I've had a lot of aid in people being around, you know, to help make sure it's put up correctly and make sure there's no health and safety risks. Then brilliant. Other places I've had no support, and I've had to get my own parents to come in and support me in installing the artwork, which obviously, you know, it's great that I have that support, but a lot of other people don't. And I think, again, it depends on the place where you are an artist. I've never faced anything, just from my personal experiences, where something, well, actually, I suppose I have, something has been put on in a place where they thought it would be easier for me to put it there, basically. So it's not the space that I wanted my artwork in, but because well, this wasn't brilliant, but I'm not light sensitive epileptic, so that doesn't affect me. But because I told them I was epileptic, I was put in a place where there wasn't any lights. So that was, you know, that was ignorant on the fact that they didn't ask me, are you light sensitive epileptic? I'm not, but my work was put in a place where there wasn't any flashing lights, so it wasn't put in the room where I wanted it, where there was videos. So, you know, it was, you know, and I think it just depends on the place where you apply and how supportive they are to the artists, and also what they know about certain disabilities. You know, it's probably my own fault as well. I didn't tell them, but it you know, it should have been something that they asked me. But that's just been my experience personally, and I think that, you know, can apply to all other places a lot other than galleries. But just getting to know the person and also getting to know the artwork as well, that really helps. I don't know what anyone else has had that experience.
I think with what you've just said, the experience, I mean, if you've said to them that you're epileptic, they have taken that into consideration, and it comes down to more of a two-way conversation. So you could have said, I'm epileptic, but it's not light sensitive epilepsy. So sometimes it's not down to the organization to ask that question. They've listened to what you've said and taken that into consideration in that situation. So it's just a longer conversation was needed. And that's why I guess that lots of people nowadays are developing access riders, so that they might develop them with the organization, or they might already have an access rider, but they're putting it in place so that these conversations can happen. So the access rider might say, I'm epileptic, but it's not light sensitive epilepsy. So then that organization is clearer from the outset, you know, and I you know, I'm good with this, I'm not good with this, and you're kind of bullet pointing these different things that the organization will learn from. And then it's a two-way learning, but also it gets the best result for everyone in that situation. So I wouldn't just put it back onto the organization and it's all their fault, because they had listened to you in the first place and put it in the place that they thought was best for you. It just means that a longer conversation needed to be had. But I think in terms of organizations, and the question that was asked by Mel, is that I think more value is being placed on work now, but I still, like I keep saying, there's still a long way to go. So there's more work being shown, but I still think quite often if you approach an organization say if you're a supported studio working with like learning disabled artists, they might be like, oh, we'd like to work with you because they want to be seen to do the right thing. But then all of their main gallery spaces are booked up, so they are offered the learning and community space, which in my opinion it shouldn't be, because it should be valued in the same way as any other artwork. So they should be like, you know, we haven't got any gaps within the next year, should we talk about in 3 years time whether we can program something into the main spaces, so that it's valued at the same way? Because ultimately then, if audiences are going in and audiences don't know anything about this work, if you're seeing it in the learning and community space as an audience member, you're automatically, on the whole, devaluing that work because it's seen in a community space, and because then the gallery hasn't valued it enough, in my opinion, to put it into the main spaces. So then the audience might not value it enough either, because they think, oh, I'll just value it in the same way that the organization has. And that's how this stigma is still existing, that people working out of supported studios or working out of day centers or any of these different things, their work isn't being given the value that I believe the artist should be given. And that's why I mentioned that comment last year. And it normally is that the learning and community space is in a difficult to reach place, or it's next to the toilets, or it's not in a prominent place within that venue. So automatically, again, it's not given the same value and recognition that I feel that it deserves. So I feel like things are changing, and places like Autograph in London have been working alongside Project Artworks, which is a supported studio. And last year they had a solo show of one of their artists in the main spaces of Autograph. And it was a beautiful show. It was beautifully hung. Everything about it was done in the same way that any other show would be hung. And that's how it should be. It's just that when you're offered these other spaces, you then aren't necessarily offered the art handlers or the same budget that you would get if you get these other spaces. So things are never done to the same standard.
It's really interesting, because it's almost what you're talking about is a reflection of what we see within wider society. And, you know, the fact that there can sometimes be that stereotyping and stigmatization that can lead to being treated differently and feeling less valued. What you're describing is almost that sometimes it is on the gallery's intent to almost, you know, get some brownie points, or it's a bit of a token gesture and seen as a kind of community act, as opposed to those artists being seen as credible within their own right. Presumably when somebody, you know, is trying to negotiate having some space to share their artwork, you have to provide that background, because I wonder if nobody knew anything about the background of that individual, does that level the playing fields more, or is that something that would never happen?
They will always ask for the background of the individual. I mean, I should also say, like, these community spaces or learning spaces, like, also for some artists, that is a major opportunity for them to be in a major gallery space, to have their work hanging on the walls. And we can't discredit the importance of that to build someone's confidence and self-esteem, that they can take their family and take their friends there and be like, my work is hanging in this space. And I don't ever want to take away the importance of that, no matter where it is in the building. Just in my personal opinion, I would rather it was hung in the main gallery spaces, so that they're valued in the same way as anybody else. So I'm not discrediting the fact at all of using those spaces. I would just, in my opinion, prefer to see it in the same space as everybody else and not relegated to another area.
I think there's a couple of points there, because I agree with Jennifer completely. But I think one of the things is often we're guilty of marginalize those spaces as something less, when in fact they are equal, you know, because there's nothing wrong in a community art. Community art is equal with the classics on all levels. And so we do that to ourselves extent. But again, it comes back to the funders. And I think this is the key thing, that something, if you really want to make a difference, someone like the Arts Council, instead of sort of saying you have to do this, it should be inbuilt into funding, for example, of any gallery, that within the next 3 years, they have to have not just some disability art here and there, but they must have it in a major space within their gallery. So that funding needs to be much more prescriptive. And again, I'm being very unfair on the Arts Council. Local authorities have a key role to play in this, because often they may not fund it to the degree that the Arts Council often, but they may own the building, they may employ the staff, And actually they have as much say as the Arts Council, and they need to be much more demanding from what they're offering to their citizens. And they are supposed to represent all of their citizens, learning disabled, physically impaired, everything. So I think it's that you need those parallel things happening at the same time, so that they have to do it, and then they have to do it a bit more, and then they have to do it at the top level. And I think that that's very important. And equally, we have to value the spaces that we do have and that we do share in much more. And Jennifer is saying this as well. It's much more than they are. They're not second class. They are equal to first class. And that's very important that we get that across.
Yeah, and I think actually what you're talking about here reflects some of what we were speaking about earlier in a session today, and the idea that as university staff, we need to reflect the diversity of our student population, and equally that applies within art spaces, where the people who are going to be coming into those spaces to actually view the artwork are going to be diverse in nature. And so actually having diversity in the artists whose work is being shown is important, because you know, you want to be able to see in yourself in that artwork to some degree. Thank you very much for answering my questions, Julian. I'm sorry to have dived in.
I just wanted to jump in as well, because I mean, I remember you saying in your talk last year, Jennifer, as well, that a lot of curators were looking at artists in terms of their academic backgrounds, you know, sort of like, and not sort of like literally focusing as much care and attention they should have done on their actual work. And obviously, there's a real problem in terms of people with disabilities generally have, you know, because the lives we lead are far less likely to have gone down that academic road into, and in terms of getting that experience. I mean, is this have you seen much of this in terms of this being a problem yourself?
I think definitely over the last year this has shifted, and more curators are visiting disability art studios. They're getting out there to other spaces, to other people with their own studios that don't necessarily belong to other studios. So I think there's definitely a shift happening. I think this is a long held historical thing, and it all comes down to the power of the director and the curator. And quite often, you know, they're picking people that they like and that they've responded to and that they've known for a while. And it's about how we widen those opportunities. So it was an artist that's been part of the toolkit, a learned disabled artist called Thompson, that quite clearly was stating, like, why do they always look at whether I've been to art school or not, and why can't they just look at the aesthetics of my work and judge it that way, and make decisions that way, rather than like completely disregarding me because I haven't been to art school. Because his whole opinion is, you know, he might not have been to art school, but he does research for his work, he does all the background that goes into them, and his work is quite political. But because he hasn't been to art school, he would be overlooked in comparison to other things from some institutions, because they see him as lesser able, maybe because he hasn't been to art school. And we've had lots of conversation through the Plus Tate network because of this, and about the work that they show. So there's definitely a shift happening, and I personally have noticed a shift happening with some of the exhibitions that I've been seeing put on at the moment. But we still have a very long way to go around that, and a long way to go to educate curators around this. So I know Studio Voltaire in London, it's an organisation in London, just before the pandemic, they took curators on a tour around some different disability artists to kind of open up those conversations, and for them to see like non-verbal artists and other artists with different disabilities, and for curators to be put directly in front of that work themselves to have those conversations. And I know that was really a very powerful conversation and a powerful group. So Studio Voltaire are looking to set that up again, with the hope that, again, it opens people's eyes to the artwork that's out there by these people that haven't been to art school. Thank you.
Just to rewind back a little bit to what you were saying, Charlotte, earlier about your experience of, the accessibility of the space in which you actually were showcasing your work, and sort of like thinking in more general terms about the accessibility of spaces for all people, artists and visitors to gallery spaces with disabilities, in terms of how should we be thinking about and conceiving about art spaces. How should they be designed? How should they be created? How should they look? What adaptations should they have? And also, I'm very aware that there's a cost element here, and a lot of, right, particularly at the moment, into the position we find ourselves in the moment, in terms of everything seems to be costing more and more and more, and there's less and less money available for people to make these adaptations. But maybe we're in danger slightly of thinking that we have to completely transform spaces. It is very, very costly and expensive. And that might filter into a general reluctance in that sense. But what sort of like cost-effective measures can we do that don't incur great expenses?
That's a big question, Julian. Well, I think I'd probably say this from more of my position at the university, really, than you know, I'm not. I as someone who has the type of disabilities that I have, I've never personally experienced anything, any barriers within the art spaces that I've exhibited. But at the university, I think we're trying more to listen to people who actually can put themselves in those shoes, basically. So getting the opinions, getting focus groups together of neurodiverse people, getting focus groups together and actually listening, taking guidance from people more who actually, putting yourself in their shoes and getting other people have that voice of what they want to see and what they want to see in the gallery space is just the most important thing I think people can do. That's everyone wants to make the spaces as effective as for other people as possible. So I think, it's just about listening to other people. And I know we've discussed things like open days with you, Julian, and I think it's the same with the gallery. You can discuss things with visitors, you can discuss, put a group together where things can be shared, whether it's, I've done marketing in shopping centres before, and we did a similar thing, and we had a neurodiverse open morning for everyone to come into the shopping centre when it wasn't busy and things like that, and that came as a result of that. So I think it's just opening that up in general to many places, and I know a lot of galleries do that now, so I think things are being done. I think it's just that's the first step, and then just seeing what out of that is possible. But I'm not in the place that my disabilities unfortunately cause many access needs, so I think it's just kind of listening to people, basically. Does that answer the question? It's a very big question, sorry.
Sorry, apologies for my very, very big question. Would anybody else like to sort of like literally say something about in relation to my very big question? Please don't ask me to repeat again.
Could you repeat the question?
Okay, very, very simply, yes, the spaces themselves. When we think about a gallery space, how should it look? What adaptation should be there? But also, if we're beyond simply sort of like the big sort of like changes, what small changes, adaptations, cost effective, simple measures could be done relatively inexpensively that would make a significant difference?
Well, I suppose I would say I think galleries are more accessible than they've ever been. Thanks to the lottery, which has spent a lot of money on kind of physical access. I think now more it's about opening the minds of curators. I think I would say, and again, it comes back to the fund's responsibility ensuring this. I would argue we don't have any responsibility to educate curators into what we do. They have a responsibility to find out what we do, and they have that responsibility. They don't, and that to me is a failure of funders across the board. But it's changing. That's what the Tate Plus is doing, and I think that it's great. It's a really fantastic thing. But they all need to be doing that a lot more, and I think that's making the change. Little things, I'm sure there's lots of little things, and they're easy to achieve by listening to the people who you're getting in and you're engaging and you're involving, who you are seeking out to learn about them, and not just them, but their aesthetic sensibilities in relation to the creation of art. Because often when you talk about access, we often lose the notion of art, actually, and we've got to keep bringing it back to that we often have a different aesthetic. We have a different way of interpreting what we see as art and through our art. And actually that can offer great opportunity. It can often create a lot of cost as well, I'm sure. You know, I don't know how lots of people, disabled people, interpret and aesthetically explore their art. But the point I would make is that often galleries and curators will go out of their way for a name and spend an absolute fortune to ensure that they can exhibit the way that they want to. But when it comes to disability, disabled artists, disability art, whatever you want to call it, it is kind of like this, the space you get on with it. Whereas it's actually not about money, it's about an attitude. And it's about a desire to open the avenues of expression, aesthetics, and curation and exhibition, and being prepared to put the money into it in a way that they are for the exhibitions that they want. And that to me is the difference, if that makes any sense.
I suppose. Sorry.
I want to slightly disagree with what you said there, saying that yes, curators have a responsibility to educate themselves. I wouldn't necessarily say that comes down to funding. That comes down to whether the curator is open for change.
Absolutely.
That's not down to money. That's down to whether this curator is wanting to be more inclusive in their curation, if they want to stay on the same path they've always been on, because that's what they know. And I guess in terms of like small changes, like this is why this toolkit exists that I've been pulling together with the network and with the artists and DANK, because it has these small changes and it has the bigger changes. But like one of the big things at the moment is like sensory maps and sensory guides that some organizations have started to produce that go on their website and go at the start of an exhibition, so that when particularly neurodivergent audiences or families enter those spaces, they're aware of the different senses and the different things they're going to be faced with when they enter those senses. And I think this is a really important thing that has started to happen, that's really helping people navigating the spaces and also knowing whether they're suitable to go to them or not, because I think in the past some people have gone to them not knowing exactly what it was going to be, and it's been quite traumatizing or anxiety inducing for them. And these sensory maps and sensory guides that are now coming out from some different places are really important. And also just putting like a visual guide on your website, like this is our building. You know, people are producing these simple stories where it's like the cafe is here, it looks like this, to get to the toilets it's this direction, there's so many, you know, there's 6 floors, there's lifts. So it's like a basic guide telling you about the inside of the space, which again is making it easier for people to get to these spaces. And this is something that's very simple to pull together with some photos to guide people, to enable them to access the space in a way more suited to them. So there's the small things like that that are now actively being done, right up to much bigger changes that can be implemented.
Just coming back about you slightly disagreeing with me about, you know, it's up to individual curators. I would say it isn't up to individual curators. It should be, if they're not doing it, they're not fit for the job. And that's where the funders and the employers come in, as opposed to the employees, to ensure that that is being done. And that's where the funders come in. And I think that that's essential, because again, we're in danger of reinventing the wheel again, because again, I sound like I'm going on about being old, but you know, we've done a lot of these things before, and actually where it always falls down, it comes to back to being, oh, it's the individual gallery's choice, it's the individual curator's choice. We're beyond that. It's got to be that it's compulsory and there's consequences for failure to do it. It's as simple as that.
It's not compulsory. It's not part of their funding in order to alter what they're doing. It's not, they don't have to give a list of the different things that they're doing in order to make them more inclusive.
I agree, and they should.
Okay, can I ask a question in relation? Well, I will ask a question. just slightly connected to what you were saying, well, actually, no, very, very, very connected to what you're saying there, Jen, because you were describing the sort of like the connection between the physical gallery space and also the online sort of like presence as well. Now, I think we started to see something that has been happening ever increasingly, which is the documentation of the exhibition experience, the online presence, the online experience, which for a lot of people is actually still the only sort of like experience they actually have access to, because they're not actually able to actually, you know, make, you know, arrive at spaces in person. I think what should be done in terms of making those sort of online visual experiences as accessible as possible? What simple sort of like measures that aren't currently sort of like thought of as being priorities, sort of like be rethought of as being that priorities, if that makes sense?
The problem was that they were prioritized during the pandemic, and lots of the big institutions switched to creating a tour of the exhibition, and sometimes the curator would be taking people on a tour and everyone could access that digitally. So it wasn't just made for disabled audiences, it was made for anyone who's not able. So if you live in St Ives, you're not able to go to Edinburgh. So I thought that was, you know, such a great thing, that one of the big things that came out of the pandemic was these things happening. And then as soon as the pandemic finished, it was like, okay, we can stop doing that again now. And so I've been having lots of conversations, and I know Amanda, who's part of this, who's one of the panelists, has put something in the chat around this as well, that the tape were doing. But it's that I don't think people realize the lifeline that people had of accessing that culture throughout lockdown, and also for them just accessing that culture that they've never been able to access if they're unable to travel anywhere for any reason. For that to be taken away again is a massive thing that I don't think organizations have realized, the importance of taking away that digital side of things. So I know Amanda's doing a lot of work around it, and I'm having a lot of conversations around just simple things. It doesn't even need to be a fancy video. It could be someone on their phone adding subtitles to it if a curator's talking, so that's an accessible thing that people can watch online. It doesn't have to be a high-end production. It can just be a way that people can access that space if they're unable to access it for any multitude of reasons. So having things like that, and also having access to, if panel discussions are recorded, or if you're able to access it hybridly, so it's in person and you can watch it online at the same time. Again, this happened during lockdown where lots of them switched online, and now they've switched back to in person and just dropped the digital availability. And I think everyone needs to be reminded that you're not just bringing it in for disabled, deaf, neurodivergent, you're bringing it in for anyone unable to access that event at that particular time, and to remind people the importance of these recorded conversations for people to watch that are unable to get to them. It's been lost, and it's frustrating, and there's lots of conversations happening to bring it back, but it's a very simple thing that can be brought back. It doesn't include, you know, it's not massive budgets to have to be put in place here.
No, I mean, I was really struck by the energy and the time and effort that you go into making sure your online presence is as accessible as it possibly can be, particularly the fact that you're very conscious that a lot of people who are hearing impaired, that sign language is their first language, and that even if you sort of like put subtitles onto podcasts or videos, you're still sort of like not really fully catering for people's needs there. And I know you put a lot of time, energy, and effort to ensure that a lot of your videos also have signing as well, which is something that you don't see because it's very rarely considered as being important or relevant. And we've been doing a series of podcasts for Disability History Month, and the astonishing thing that I've discovered is that, unless I'm completely wrong here, but none of the major sort of like podcasting streaming services actually have subtitling as a feature. None of them. There seems to be no way, for instance, that you can include subtitling on content you upload to SoundCloud, Spotify. Actually, no, you can with Spotify apparently, but only if you're actually using a premium service, which of course goes against the whole the sort of concept of being accessible. And
If you've got that podcast, are you also providing a transcript?
this is what I was going to say, is that you almost, by default, you are in a position where you have to actually sort of like go that extra step yourself to do this. I still find it astonishing that the services aren't doing this themselves. And I'm equally astonished by some of the reactions when you speak to people, and it's almost assumed that why would somebody who's hearing impaired want to actually engage in the podcast in the first place, rather than why wouldn't they, and why wouldn't we actually just go make it available to them in whatever format they need.
I mean, I guess there's a program called Otter on the computer that you can put things into, or have it playing when you're on Zoom or something, and it does a pretty good job of like getting you a written description of it. But then I use Otter, and then I physically go back into it to check it, because sometimes it's just gobbledygook. And then I have to like maybe rewatch the video to check when someone said something, or it often spells people's names wrong. But that is a good way to get an overview of like a transcript available that then you can go back in and edit. But I think people don't also realize the importance of a transcript. So like the new Turner show, the Turner Prize show in Tate Liverpool, was flagged by the White Pube because they didn't have any transcripts available of the videos in the space. And since that article came out, the Tate Liverpool, where it's at, has now made transcripts available of it. But it shouldn't be that someone tells you that they should be there. They should just be producing it, because they should be thinking with that accessible mindset in place that, you know, some people may need a transcript of this so that they can interact with it.
Thank you.
Julian, I'm conscious that we're running towards the end
My
of our
words
time.
exactly.
So
Wow.
we might want to think about a final question maybe and wrapping up, I'm afraid.
Yeah, well, obviously, this has been a wonderfully engaging sort of like informed conversation. It could go on for hours and hours and hours. And the fear is when you start these conversations, you're always worried about what are we going to be able to say? And it appears that all of us have a lot to say. But I think what I'd like to do is I'd like to see some positives come from this conversation. So I think I said at the beginning about that I was keen to see where this conversation would be if we were to revisit it again at some point in the future. So with that very, very much in mind, I just wanted to ask maybe a couple of questions. I'll start off with one question. So what we've talked a little bit about what is happening now, but what things do we see now in terms of being a precursor that might actually point towards the kind of sort of like accessible spaces we sort of like think should exist, whether they be physical spaces or online experiences, but also, you know, literally point towards, you know, a situation where disabled artists don't continue to sort of like encounter the same barriers and challenges that they currently seem to be facing in terms of establishing careers or meaningful presences in the art world.
Well, I'm just excited to see hopefully what changes this toolkit brings about, not only for these organisations, but for the artists that hopefully it will then involve and help them to be presented more and supported more by the visual arts in general. And everyone that's been coming to these meetings, all of these big arts organisations have had to pledge like small things and big things that they're going to do over the next year. And this toolkit is like an ever evolving document. So it's going to be updated every 6 to 12 months in order to keep it fresh. And if new things come about, they will be added and it will be recirculated so that it's always got the most up-to-date information within it.
It would be great to see that at some point, you know, and as it evolves over time.
It's being designed, so once it's been designed, it will be released.
Brilliant. Thank you very much to all the panelists. Oh, sorry, Julian.
Sorry, one final question, because I'm very aware that that, you know, there will be people, hopefully people involved in this discussion who come here and have been to all of the events today and have been wanting to support disabled people and want to learn about how they can actually do that. And I wonder if any of the panelists have any advice or words of encouragement for people in terms of how they can actually engage and how they can actually sort of like become, you know, positive allies in terms of actually helping to stand alongside us and sort of like, you know, not necessarily demand, but sort of like help inform the decision processes, so that we have an expression that we're using quite a lot actually in the podcast that we're recording, which is how do we move the boat faster? And I see that how we move the boat faster is not just us as disabled people or people who are very heavily involved in sort of currently involved in helping sort of like disabled artists in terms of establishing their careers, their presence, their foothold in the art world, but also people who want to sort of like be engaged, want to be help and show solidarity and allyship. So does anybody have any sort of like you know, advice or encouragement or words to sort of like inspire people in that sense?
Well, I would say, you know, contact your local disability art organisation or whatever it's called, or whatever version it is. I think that's a good thing to do. And I think the person's comment earlier about support in doing fairs, etc. Collectives are a great way of doing that. That's both self-help plus, you know, getting other support as well. And there's a lot of good organisations out there that offer support, Dash in Shropshire, you know, us in Wolverhampton. But equally, I think one of the things we need to acknowledge is the way universities and university research are actually often leading the change, I think, that we need through what they're doing. It's a terrible thing to say, but to me, art doesn't change the world, but actually the changes that we as disabled people are making in the world can change art. And that's what's important for me.
And I would echo that around, yeah, contacting your local. Well, there's lots of national disability arts things like Shape Arts, Disability Arts Online, Dash in Shropshire. You know, getting in touch with some of these bigger organisations, DANC, that are based in Manchester, to look at how you can get involved and support more widely the disabled community. All of these organisations will be able to pinpoint you in the right direction.
Yeah, we all offer mentoring and stuff like that. So, you know, I think there's great opportunities there, and equally badger your local art gallery to do something for you. Put on exhibitions of disability art. No harm in badgering them as well.
Mm-hmm.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us and for that discussion. Julian, I know you had a whole list of questions that you wanted to get asked. I don't know whether you managed all of them, but I think hopefully you managed a good spread.
I think we had a very, very good, as I said earlier, and I said I hoped for, and you know, an informed and much needed and impassioned discussion. And that's precisely what we got. And so I can't thank you everybody for being a part of this discussion.
In answer to the question in the chat, every session is being recorded today, and so I'll drop my email in the chat, because I don't know whether you're internal to the org or not, to the university or not, but if you're not, if you perhaps just supply me with your email address, I can make sure that a copy of the recording is sent to you. If there's no further questions, I think we'll bring that session to a close. Thank you again, everybody. And I provided links in the chat to further events we've got going on as part of Disability History Month here at the university. And thank you very much. Have a fantastic evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.